Hello and welcome to S&P Global Sustainability Matters. I'm your host, Mona Naqvi, bringing you the latest in the business, expert insights, and cutting-edge solutions to sustainability matters for investment professionals. Today, we're going to be talking about scaling the transition, and I'm pleased to be joined by the one and only Curtis Ravenel, a man who needs no introduction. He's been there, he's seen it, and he's done it all. He's been the key architect behind so many of those acronyms we talk about almost every day in this space, be it FSB, G20, TCFD, GFANZ. He's done it all. So thank you, Curtis, so much for joining us.
Mona, it's great to be here. Thank you.
My pleasure. So Curtis, speaking of all of your many accomplishments, you've been in this space a while, and you've seen and done a lot. Walk me through your career to date and some of the standards and frameworks that you've helped to drive.
Well, I think my interest started really right out of college. I worked for an NGO, and they asked me to write a paper on full cost accounting. Being a history major, that did not come naturally to me. So
I could see why.
It got me interested in sort of what I would call broadly environmental economic. Life gets in the way. I go to business school. I begin to work at Bloomberg doing really traditional finance jobs. So I was an analyst, capital planning, financial controller for Asia. But all along, that interest was there. And I pitched to senior management that we should really begin implementing sustainability at Bloomberg. And that means across the board, operations, products and services, and even some of Mike's philanthropic giving.
Mm-hmm.
And it was so interesting to me because we, especially around the ESG product, we really wanted to build a product to serve investors. And the data was a mess. We all know this. And so we looked at how we could get more sort of financially relevant and material information and realized that it wasn't really available. You had the great work of the Global Reporting Initiative and to CDP, but it was a lot of information, and it was designed to sort of say, how does your business activity impact the environment and society, instead of how does society and the environment impact potential financial performance.
Right.
Everyone's interested in that, in the latter. We discovered ISSB at that time, and they were, maybe had 10 employees and $100,000 in grant money, but their business plan and Gene Rogers' vision was so compelling that we decided to go all in and gave a very significant 7-figure grant to them. And Mike became chairman and Mary became the vice chair. And so that became a very big thing. They were successful, as you know, because they did 2 primary things. One was this focus on financial materiality, and they did a lot of research to support that. And 2, the sector specificity. That hadn't been developed yet. So that was, to me, the first sort of breakthrough. Then they got widespread adoption from investors who used it in their engagement to get companies to disclose. One of their biggest findings was that climate was the broadest, it cut across all sectors more than any other ESG issue. I jokingly call climate the big C in ESG. And this really was the beginning. And then Mark Carney gave this well-known speech, I'm sure to you, as a former BOE person.
Yes.
Called The Tragedy of the Horizons, right?
Yeah. There's another reason why that means a lot to me. We'll get to that in a second.
Yes. And indicated in that speech that they were looking to do something at the FSB with regard to climate specifically. And so Mary Shapiro and I, who had been working on SASB, approached Mark about participating in this bit. And by the end of it, it was decided that Mike would be a good chair, and that Mary and myself and several others would help run it. Now, I've done lots of sort of projects like that over the years, but I've never expected it to be as successful. I think the TCFD was successful for a few reasons. One, it was the right time.
Yeah.
SASB had well-established financial materiality as a theme around some of these issues. We wrote the document with the mind that you would speak to mainstream C-suite board members, not in climate speak. You'll note that if you read the TCFD as a former Bank of England person, you'll note that it tries to use the language of regulators, because everyone in the financial community and beyond do read regulators' work. And so, and then lastly, the forward-looking bit around scenario analysis. That was sort of a milestone moment. And then we were able to get widespread adoption of this too. It helps when it's, I always say the most important acronym within the TCFD is the FSB in the front of it, because that gave it credibility and lent, made people pay attention. All of that is around disclosure, right? Disclosure is a means to an end in a way, right? If your thesis is the market allocates capital efficiently, given all available information, it's that last part that hadn't really landed. And I think all of those efforts that I mentioned tried to help give more information to help people make smart capital allocation decisions. Now where we are today is it is sort of moving from disclosure to action, and that's where GFANZ, Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, comes in, because what we're really trying to do is scale transition finance to get the capital where it's needed faster. It took 8 years for TCFD to become part of the regulatory framework, and I have to mention, most people think it's now embedded in regulation. It's actually just proposed to be embedded in regulation, and we don't have 8 years now. We need to make significant progress on the transition well in advance of 2030. And so GFANZ have been trying to sort of use the basic frameworks of that. Go to the next step. The last piece, and I'll finish my point here. The last bit of work that the TCFD did, its last publication, was metrics, targets, and transition planning, where we basically recommended that, once you've done your scenario analysis and identified the risks and opportunities, you now need a plan to implement it. And so we've tried to pick up where that left off at GFANZ and kind of give a more robust sort of plan on how you would develop a transition plan for both real economy and financial institutions.
My goodness, Curtis, you've done and seen so much of this space. I want to take a step back a little bit. You talked about moving beyond disclosures to outcomes. And you also touched on how, from a disclosure standpoint, what you're really trying to do is provide more information, more transparency about data to help inform efficient capital allocation decisions. In that, somewhere, is there the assumption that I think some of us in this space sometimes take for granted, that the prior disclosure environment or the standards that drove them, be it annual reporting, 10Ks, or traditional financial disclosures, there was something critically missing?
Yeah. In short, yes. I think it's been a challenge. Any company who have a team of lawyers will tell you, please do not disclose anything that is not absolutely required. Now, there's the concept of financial materiality, and thou shalt disclose all material issues. We think, and I forgot to mention this earlier, the TCFD really, I think, also taught firms how to think about climate as a potential financially material issue. I think it's not the result. Companies, were trying to understand. They didn't have a good handle on climate and how it could impact. And so the TCFD was also a guide to sort of say, here's how you think about it. And, unfortunately, extreme weather events have accelerated, frankly, much faster than we thought they would in 2015. When we wrote the recommendations, we had sort of physical risk on one hand and transition risk on the other. And for the audience, physical risk is sort of chronic and acute. So storms being acute, chronic being water shortages. And transition risk is technology development and deployment, market sentiment changing, and importantly, policy environment. And the good news is on the transition side, that risk is coming at us quickly, which is a good thing.
Yep, gets us moving.
We need to transition.
Correct.
Unfortunately, at the same time, so is the physical risk. So I think, we had a vision back in 2015, but I think we were thinking this stuff was going to be further out, and we're trying to train the market to think further out. Now it's become quite tangible to people, and so there's a real motivation. It's not, we have over 600 firms who are part of GFANZ, the world's largest coalition of investors, lenders, and underwriters committed to net zero. It's not because they're all lovely people and want to do the right thing. It's because they actually see the risk on the physical side and they see the opportunity on the transition side. So there's silver lining out there in the storm cloud.
Well, I'm sure some of them are nice people as well. We won't discredit them too much. But yes, I take your point. This is about financially material risk on the balance sheet. But it's interesting mentioning the kind of relationship between transition and physical risk. I think both types of risk for most investors who are implementing these data sets, they're well understood, but the relationship between them is a little bit interesting because theoretically they should really work inversely towards one another, correct?
Yeah.
Because if you're failing to transition, then you are in theory more exposed to the physical impacts of climate
Correct.
change. But if you are adequately transitioning, we should hopefully see the curbing of some of those physical risks. But that doesn't seem to be happening right now. So were we just too late? What's going on?
It's a collective problem, right? You've got the sort of macro and the micro. In theory, if everyone was transitioning faster, the physical risk would be less. The other flip side of that theory is as the physical risks get more severe, the transition risks increase as well because policy might be slow to the draw, but it's happening now. You've seen a fair amount, especially in the EU, but also globally, Singapore, Hong Kong. People are beginning to really implement policy. In the US, the IRA, for example. So you're now seeing this accelerated policy implementation, which then sort of furthers transition risk, but in the end, it's a collective problem, right? You need the whole system doing this, and we're still a little disjointed, right?
Right. That's actually the spirit of that infamous, or famous, I should say, tragedy of the Horizon speech, which I did say I wanted to come back to. Side note, the reason why it was so important to me, I don't know if you remember, Curtis, but very long time ago, some friends and I at the 2 Degrees Investing Initiative had a whole project called The Tragedy of the Horizons. And we looked at this issue because it was, for those that aren't familiar, borrowing the sort of tragedy of the commons parlance from traditional economics. And that is very much to your point about a lack of coordination around properly accounting for externalities that we might not otherwise be accounting for. Right. And so it's sort of come full circle. If we're talking about data and information that isn't being disclosed because it's not required of companies, there's that information that's potentially missing. Yeah. But there may well be information that is relevant to something beyond just the bottom line, or at least not what we're accounting for. So from your perspective, that tragedy of the horizons, is that a concept now that is better understood? And is that exactly what you're trying to tackle with all of these frameworks? Or is that still some mysterious thing that's kind of looming over us all?
I think you have to operate where you can have influence. So by way of example, it was the G20 that asked the FSB to look at systemic risk, right, in the financial system due to climate. The TCFD's remit was not to identify that and determine if there was. It was to say, if we want to avoid the systemic risk, it would be very helpful to get lots of information into the marketplace to help avoid the tragedy that arises. So our task was simply to make recommendations for what companies and investors should disclose. Didn't solve the systemic question. And as we've seen, this climate, while it is a global challenge, it's acute in different ways, in different jurisdictions, in different sectors, different business models. I mean, it's a really thorny question. I am, for one, cautiously optimistic that given the rise of natural language processing and large, AI, even blockchain, satellite, that we are going to ultimately be able to get a real handle on some of those externalities. Now, whether we act on them or not is another matter, and we'll leave that to the policymakers and regulators. But I do think this combination of both company disclosure and systems level data over time, it's going to take some time. These things just take some time. And the goal is, are we transitioning? Yes. Are we transitioning fast enough? Not yet.
Right.
Notice I didn't say no.
Yes. Spoken like a true diplomat. So that's encouraging. So it's not too little too late. There is the good chance that we can still wrap our heads around this as an industry, but it's going to take a bit of coordination, a little bit of transparency.
We're not great at global coordination.
No, that is true.
We do have.
Have we ever been?
That's fair. No, I don't think we have. But when you have key jurisdictions moving, the world does tend to adopt more and more consistent approaches over time. But it takes a lot of work, and I think there's a much wider understanding of the challenge, a much broader acceptance that things must move quickly. So again, I'm cautiously optimistic.
Good. Well, speaking of the work, as I mentioned, this is a show for investment professionals who are looking at this data every day, in theory, and trying to wrap their heads around it. From the investment practitioner perspective, I know you don't necessarily work directly with investors per se. I mean, you're working with the whole ecosystem, not just investors, on the portfolio management side. But how is it that you think that they ought to be going about integrating this information into their investments? We've touched on the financial materiality piece. Hopefully they're doing the due diligence that's necessary to ensure whether or not it's relevant for their own investment strategy.
Right.
But is there some sort of practical guidance that GFANZ offers, or any other of the frameworks, FSB, of course, giving them the sort of toolkit to think about it? But how should they be going about integrating this stuff?
Well, I mean, there is no shortage of methodologies. We've tried, I think you've seen over time, there used to be a lot of frameworks. And then there was some consolidation where you had the IIRC and SASB get together. And now they've rolled up into the IFRS. And as your listeners, many of them may know, TCFD is sunsetting. And the IFRS is and ISSB specifically, is going to take that work forward. And that work meaning monitoring progress on adoption. Of course, IOSCO's come out in support of the ISSB. We'll have to do an acronym.
These are seasoned folks, so don't worry.
And so, you do have sort of the big markets not doing exactly the same thing, right? You've got the EU with all of their approaches, right? The CSRD and it's all its affiliated disclosures. You have the SEC doing their thing, the United States Securities and Exchange Commission. Then you also have ISSB, which has 140 jurisdictions under the IFRS umbrella, that with IOSCO's support will begin to adopt the ISSB. There's more similarities between those disclosure regimes than people, I think. So I'm not, when people say, oh, it's too fragmented, it's way less fragmented than it used to be. It doesn't mean that we got it perfect. So those, I think the guidance within those ecosystems is going to be important. If when I speak to financial institutions, I think in the end, it's really about the single best advice that I have is to institutionalize this across the firm.
Yeah.
What that means is, and this from earlier days, the sustainability people used to be in a little silo off to the side. Now that this is part of the regulatory environment, that means the CFO's office, strategy team, the risk team, all the investment folks, you really need to build institutional capacity, because the other thing that we have seen that is tried and true is that this field evolves very quickly. So all of those disclosure regimes I mentioned, they talk about transition planning, but there's not a lot of guidance. And then you read today that European Central Bank is thinking about using transition planning and capital requirements. So the field is evolving. If you're working in the field, you have job security, because things are changing quite a bit. So it really is about building the institutional capacity in different areas to be able to tackle as the field continues to evolve quickly. So I don't have specific advice for how you do it, because as we said, it depends on your sector exposure. It depends on, are you an analyst for a PM, or are you on the debt side? I mean, it's all varied quite differently. But there are a lot of really great resources. And a lot of it's about that capacity building internally, but also the engagement you have with whoever you're lending, underwriting, or investing in.
Absolutely. Well, therein lies a little bit of the problem, though. I mean, just listening to you, I mean, I've been in this space for my entire career, and even I, sometimes get a little scrambled with all those acronyms. There's a lot there. But, the capacity building is critical. I think also we as an industry need to remember sometimes that this is financially material, which of course you outlined at the beginning. And it's really no different to any other type of financial risk. I mean, yes, it has taken tremendous work from a sustainability NGO community to help accelerate the education. But really at this point, we've passed the baton on. This is an investment risk that we're talking about. And investors, just like any other type of risk, are going to have to, they're going to have the risk teams, the legal teams, everybody, looking at all of the potential hazards that they would otherwise. So the fact that it's sustainability is really no different.
No, I agree with that. And we even thought about that with the TCFD and how we structured it around governance, strategy, risk, metrics, target. It's the framing. you could take any issue, not just climate, and use that sort of framing. It was designed not to be an exercise outside of how you normally run a business.
Right.
And that was very important to do. It is just another issue that you need to be familiar with. You need to understand the implications, and you need to learn the best ways to apply that. I think as I said, so many factors go into how you do that. I do think we have to acknowledge that the information still is not where it needs to be. It currently doesn't have the same rigor and generally accepted sort of needs that financial information have. I think that's changing. This is the ISSB's disclosure regime, and the SEC's and the EU's are all designed to be assurable, and that's going to be important. When it becomes a requirement, that does tend to get everyone in line with what's needed. But again, this is not an agenda to try to save the world. This is about managing financial risk and looking for the best risk-adjusted returns, taking into consideration these things that have really proven themselves, especially recently, to be financially material.
Yeah, absolutely. In some ways, we've come a little bit full circle, though, because you talked at the beginning about how the sustainability industry in the early days was more about looking at the sustainability impacts of a firm on society and the world more broadly. Then came the rigor of SASB and all of the work, the Global Reporting Initiative, all the great things you mentioned at the beginning, to talk about the relevance and the financial materiality to investors, which has been critical to helping to mainstream this as a topic and create that job security for the likes of you and me. Thank you. But now, as we've sort of come full circle with a bit of this politicization and the backlash, it is sometimes challenging to kind of to square that circle, because we are talking about very financially material investment risks, but alongside very emotive, important topics that do have a significant, tremendous impact on society and the environment. And there's been a lot of work that the TCFD and others, other standards have done in terms of, the principle of do no significant harm and encouraging a just transition. And there's a lot in that. But first, let me ask you, how are you seeing the sort of backlash against ESG impact the ability to accelerate the transition? Yeah. Is that a concern for the folks that you're speaking with? And then maybe we can touch a little bit more on how investors from a practical lens can really kind of integrate that more holistic look at all of the different variables and for a just transition.
I think these are all really good and complicated points. I just want to be clear that the work I've done has primarily been focused on financial materiality because, one, it was the remit of the TCFD, and two, I was at Bloomberg before, and we were trying to design product to sell to the whole market. And
right.
The whole market didn't, frankly, care about impact, but the whole market cared about materiality. The good news is, between GRI and CDP, all the issues or all the financially material stuff was in there. It was designed as a multi-stakeholder, and it was really good at issue identification. And over time, much of what they asked for does become financially material as the crisis grows. So I think what SASB and TCFD did was try to say, let's look at the universe well defined and established by them and figure out where we can get agreement on evidence of financial materiality and present that in a way to the investors. Now, we know that impact reporting is important for all the reasons we talked about earlier. There's a loop here. And most of the things that are financially material also do have impact benefits, carbon emissions being the obvious one. That is a risk to a regulated industry as carbon pricing and or disclosure come into play. But it's also a huge risk to the planet. So that it does capture a portion of those externalities. And so Europe is moving ahead with the double materiality, and someone has to do that. I think there's a confusion in the market where many people think regulators and, for example, the ISSB should do double materiality. That's not their remit, right? You can legislate double materiality because you're an elected body. A regulator really has to stick, as you well know, to financial materiality. And so sometimes our friends on the NGO side sort of miss, like, you pull the levers that you can, right? So I think in the end, The backlash is a realization that some of this work does have impact, and I guess I'm a woke capitalist. So, the
Self-reported woke capitalist. I don't mean hearing that. I didn't call you that.
I mean, honestly, it's just it's politics. I do think it makes the transition a little bit harder because it does put fear in companies. What I'm seeing, though, is that it's more about green hushing than it is about the work not being done. Because institutional investors, primarily asset owners, are still long-term investors. These risks are real to them. They want to see their asset managers doing the hard work. The lenders certainly see the risk all over the place. So, I think the work's still going on. I think it does create a bit of a speed bump, but I don't think it's slowing it down materially.
Great. That's good to know. I mean, these are obviously issues that I think the whole industry is grappling with from their own particular unique vantage points. But it pays to remember, I think, that individual investors have their own investment objectives.
Yeah.
And there are investors that care about impact. There are investors that care purely about, the bottom line within a very particular time horizon, and that's okay. I mean, it's not for anyone to inform an investor to, it's up to the ultimate owners of those assets to decide how to invest them. We have the standards in place to ensure that, no one's intentionally preventing that from happening. But it's really about kind of alignment with a belief system, whatever that may be. And I think all of the work that you've been doing is, as you've mentioned already, providing the transparency and the tools to allow that to happen, whatever that may be.
That's right. There are, many people will use this information in very different ways to inform their investment thesis. And it's up to them, as you well said, to how they want to use it. They might decide to go the opposite route based on what they discover. They might say, if there's never going to be a carbon price, the SEC is going to get litigated out. I'm betting that all of these hard-to-abate sectors are underpriced because we're going to keep going, and that's their decision, right? This is really all the work I've done. It's just about getting the information into the market, and then it'll be up to the investors to decide how they want to use that in their investment theses. So
absolutely. So Curtis, one last question for you, maybe before we close out this terrific discussion. There's been so much in here. I'll be unpacking this for a while. What's next? What do we need to see in terms of the frameworks, in terms of the adoption? What would you like to see happen, and over what time frame to truly scale this transition?
Yeah. So to me, what's in the near term on the horizon is we really need widespread adoption of transition planning. But like scenario analysis was kind of the anchor recommendation of the TCFD, scaling transition finance is the anchor objective transition planning. And so we have 4 financing strategies at GFANZ that we have proposed: climate solutions, supporting aligned companies to grow. But then importantly, moving into the high emitting sectors, because the transition is economic wide, it's economy wide, and you need to invest in high emitting sectors to help them get aligned. And then, of course, we have a large stock of young, high-emitting assets that probably need to be retired before the end of their economic useful life. And so we've got to get really creative with policy and philanthropy and others to try to shut those down soon. So that's the big challenges. What I would like to see between now and 2027, which is soon, is a real scaling of those 4 financing strategies and really seeing money put towards them. We are putting out a consultation around the 4 financing strategies, how you can put the appropriate guardrails around them so that you're not accused of greenwashing. It's always tough because if you're too prescriptive, you get low adoption. If you're too wide, you get low impact. And so you've got to find that Goldilocks sweet spot, which is what this consultation is about. And then also some methodologies for calculating the decarbonization contribution of that flow. So, for example, we know that we need, 4 times clean energy investment, 4-to-1 ratio between clean energy and fossil fuel, right, by 2030 on average. We're at 1-to-1 right now. So you need to see that scale. But that's just the energy sector. What about everything else? So I think industry decarbonization is going to be very important. My last point will be that, the financial community can play a significant role here, right? They've got the capital to do it, but they're just a catalyst, right? They need the underlying policy support to make that money effective, and they need companies are the ones that actually decarbonize.
Right.
And so, my recommendation is to work with the companies in your portfolio or who you lend to or underwrite to figure out what their transition plans are and to help them finance their own transition. Encourage them transition, first of all, and then help them find smart, innovative ways. And this may evolve new financial products and services. And that's what makes it exciting. But it's got to happen. We need to see real progress by 2027 because 2030 is the tipping point. And as we know, capital takes a while to move through the system to implement.
Well, it sounds like what we need is to be a victim of our own success and have less job security. So I'm not sure I'm in that much of a rush, but just kidding. No, of course. I mean, you've outlined some really terrific topics today, Curtis. Thank you so much. There's a lot of information and guidance and support out there for investors coming from a lot of the work that you've been spearheading. I, for one, learned a ton of information. I know our folks at home did as well. Forgive the acronyms. We'll make sure you know what all of those are. But stay tuned because we'll continue to learn about some more acronyms and some more frameworks and standards driving the landscape with our very own Divya Mankika. She is our Global Head of ESG Market Engagement at S&P Global Sustainable One. So stay tuned. Welcome back, folks. Thanks for sticking around. This is S&P Global Sustainability Matters, your go-to guide on sustainability matters for investment professionals. Joining me up next is Divya Mankika. She is our Global Head of Sustainability Market Engagement at S&P Global Sustainable One, here to talk about the ecosystems, landscape of frameworks and standards here in the ESG world. Divya, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
So Divya, tell me, I know you're out there in the market, you're meeting with standard setters and bodies all the time. How is this space evolving from your perspective and what are you seeing at the moment?
Yeah, it's a massive area of growth. We have clients who literally measure the compound annual growth rate of policies in sustainability. And I think the last I saw was over 40% growth every year.
In terms of new standards and frameworks?
Exactly. And that's because, everyone is trying to get to grips with how to address sustainability, particularly climate change, I think is at the top of the priority around the world. But it's also something that's quite nuanced, something where, regional dynamics and realities are important to consider. And so we've seen standards emerge locally at the state level. There's a new reporting requirement from California that just came out for climate risk reporting from companies that are doing business there. There are, federal standards or domestic standards. There's regional EU policy. And then the most exciting thing, I think, in the past year is the International Sustainability Standards Board and their release of two different frameworks that are getting a lot of attention around the world.
Fantastic. And so you're out there with a team. S&P is very active in this space. What is S&P Global's role in all of this? Are we helping to inform some of those standards? Are you sitting on boards to talk about what those standards should be? What's your role?
Yeah, absolutely. So not just my role, but really senior leadership across S&P Global are really engaged in this topic because really standards and frameworks shape how our clients are considering, prioritizing, and then measuring their sustainability performance. So they're really important for us to understand quite deeply. And we find that our clients even come to us for advice, again, because this is such a dynamic space. They're also looking for a sort of GPS of, okay, which are the ones that we need to pay attention to? What elements of that are, measurable today versus maybe a little bit aspirational? And so as an example, the Task Force for Nature-Related Financial Disclosures, a number of us were sitting on the working groups for the past 2 years, reviewing drafts, responding to consultations, sharing our data and research to help guide, what is possible, what is measurable. And then also talking to clients about, here's an emerging standard that's coming down the pike. How do you feel about it? Do you think it's feasible? Where are your challenges, potentially in reporting on nature and biodiversity in the future? So really from a number of different angles, we're trying to get to grips with this huge evolution that the global economy is going through.
So we had Curtis Ravenel on just a few moments ago, and he was telling us all about how, there are many different standards, and it can get overwhelming to talk about the alphabet soup of ESG and sustainability. But at the heart of it, many of these issues, if you were to look at the Venn diagram, they do overlap. It's not maybe as daunting as it may seem. Is that been your experience as well? Do you think that actually there's more acronyms than there are standards in a way, and actually we are still talking about the same thing, and it shouldn't be that worrying?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. It's an evolution. It's not that these things come up, out of a vacuum. So even if you take the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, the TCFD, which is probably one of the most well-known and widely used frameworks, it built its recommendation off of CDP, which used to be called the Carbon Disclosure Project, which launched in 2002, the Climate Disclosure Standards Board, some elements from the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board, SASB. I'm trying not to use too many acronyms.
Oh, don't worry, Curtis already listed more than you could imagine. So,
and so, with each evolution, I think the steering committees of these frameworks try to look at what is there, what has gotten traction in the market, take those best elements, and then just try to add what needs to be tweaked. The TNFD is a perfect example. It's in the name, right? TNFD, so similar to TCFD. The 4 pillars of governance, strategy, risk management, metrics and targets, they're the same for the two. The core questions are the same. It's just that the TNFD has, of course, contemplated nature and biodiversity, and the tweaks that are needed in analytic frameworks in order to enhance reporting to consider that topic. But really the framework, the approach, they've tried to keep it as consistent as possible in order not to overwhelm the market. And that's just not just the TNFD, I think, that's doing that. All of the standard setters appreciate to some degree, that in order for the market to adopt their framework, they need to make it feasible and they need to make it efficient to align with those frameworks.
Great, Divya. So it really does sound as if each one of these new frameworks and standards, it's not out of the blue. It's not coming from scratch. These are standing on the shoulders of giants, so to speak. And I know Curtis, we've spoken about it in terms of his view that these voluntary frameworks are almost in many cases the precursor to what then eventually becomes embedded in regulatory frameworks. And in much the same way from the kind of voluntary landscape, this is an iterative process. We're building, we're improving, we're constantly honing. And so although it does sound a little overwhelming, actually when it comes down to it, this is just progress inch by inch towards where it is we need to go, and we shouldn't be so overwhelmed by the number of different acronyms.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely correct. The ISSB started with a review of global ESG frameworks. They integrated staff from the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board and IIRC. And it's definitely the case that they look at what is working around the world and then try to elevate that into these global frameworks. I think an element that's also really important is the direct voice of investors, because all of this is ideally focusing on financially material information. And so some of the voluntary frameworks, they're testing the market for what it finds to be financially material. And then when it kind of elevates into these other bodies that have a larger remit, they have had some experience in seeing what investors are responding to, what companies are capable of delivering. And so I think that testing and experimentation process is really important.
All fantastic points, Divya. I know that Curtis also believes that this is really ultimately about financially material issues, and that will vary across industries and sectors, but it's also something that continues to evolve over time. I know that's what we see with our ESG research process. So thanks for all the work that you're doing on behalf of S&P, engaging in the market. And for those of you at home, I hope you enjoyed our conversation. If you'd like to follow more of Divya's work and learn more about our involvement in the ESG framework space, be sure to check out our research at www.spglobal.com/ESG. See you next time.